that it's really wonderful to be with you, to be able to spend a few hours with you this afternoon. And I always like to begin with a formal acknowledgement of the original inhabitants of the land on which we gather. Let us never forget the genocidal violence inflicted on indigenous people by the process of colonization. And I'd also like to say that the mandate to remember is also a mandate to work in solidarity with Native American struggles today. And with that, let me thank the organizers of this wonderful conference. I love the name, L.I.F.E, L-I-F-E, Live, Inspire, Fight, Educate, which seems to encapsulate everything we should be doing during this period. I saw the mission statement, which I'm sure you've heard. I'm going to repeat it because I really liked it. To unite and strengthen diverse individuals and organizations fighting for education, equity, justice, and various issues such as the elimination of disease, illiteracy, poverty, and ignorance through alliance building, leadership development, and action. So let's applaud that. Let me say that, excuse me if my voice doesn't, I caught a cold on Monday, and I shouldn't have been flying, but I flew across country yesterday. In the spring of 2012, all over the country and all over the world, we are all focused on issues of racial profile, on criminalization, racialization, largely because of the recent killing of Trayvon Martin in Florida. And it has reminded us here in this country, and those all over the world who have followed the generations-long struggle against racism, that we have not come nearly as far as it has been assumed. And I remember the song that participants in the 20th century freedom movement used to sing. And that song went something like this. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. Oh Lord, we've struggled so long, we must be free. But of course that last line was steeped in irony, because they knew when they sang that song that they were not free and that they would have to constantly struggle. The growing movement around the case of Trayvon Martin reminds us that people everywhere stand in solidarity with ongoing struggles against racism here in the U.S. And of course, at the age of 17, Trayvon Martin learned, and this was the very last lesson of his far too young life, that racism still infects the thoughts and emotions of many people in the U.S., and most importantly, perhaps the structures. And that racism can express itself through ravaging violence. In a lot of ways, I think that Trayvon has become so familiar to all of us that we see his face and we think of him as a friend, a son, a grandson, a brother, a cousin, a community member. And we all know the story. He casually walked home, or walked back to the home of his father's fiancée in a gated community, having gone to a convenience store to buy some iced tea and some Skittles for the son of his father's fiancée, never realizing that he would lose his life because he was young and black, and maybe also because he pulled a hoodie over his head to protect himself from the drizzle. Charles Blow wrote in an op-ed in the New York Times, "That is the burden of black boys in America and the people that love them, running the risk of being descended upon in the dark and caught in the crosshairs of someone who crosses the line." When we place this case within the context of the long struggle for freedom, not only for people of African descent, but the struggles of Chicano and Latino people, for other people of color as well, for people struggling for freedom within other regions of the world, for members of LGBT communities, for women of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, for working class people, for people with physical and mental disabilities, for people struggling against police violence and against police justification of racist violence, for people challenging unjust immigration practices. And we can also think about the implication of this struggle for freedom in relation to our current efforts to save the environment for the many generations who will hopefully follow us. And I always like to point out, for generations not only of human beings, but generations of non-human beings as well, animals and plants. And of course, the struggle for education is central to the quest for freedom. Unfortunately, we still have to ask ourselves why so many institutions of higher education continue to close their doors, whether intentionally or not, to those who are not a part of the elite. And one of the reasons I really appreciate speaking here on the campus of Rhode Island College is because I know that it is an institution that largely serves working people, and that many of the students work while they are getting their education. And another related question, why can we not treat health as a human right? Why does the food we eat often poison us instead of nurturing our bodies and our minds? How many people are sick as a direct result of capitalist food production? I raise these questions because I want us to have a broad context, and particularly a breadth that reflects the breadth of the mission statement of the organization that organized this conference. Now, I can also say that, I hope I don't lose my voice before the end of this talk. Excuse me. Struggles for freedom have always been collective struggles. Now, individuals have benefited. Many of us have benefited. But these struggles have not so much been about individuals as they have been about collectives and communities. And one of the crucial challenges of this era is to develop the ability to, I would say, dialectically negotiate the contradictions that inevitably characterize the way individuals benefit from collective struggles. Because, of course, some individuals benefit and don't think about giving back to the very communities that enable their ascendancy. And when an individual benefits from a collective struggle, it used to be the case, and I'm talking about my own personal experience, that she or he was expected to give back in order to preserve that struggle. So individual victories were never seen as the final goal of these struggles. And I like to tell the story of my mother, who benefited a great deal from community support in her own life and education. She was born in a small town in rural Alabama, and was a foster child. She never knew who her biological parents were. And her foster parents did not believe that she needed to get an education beyond elementary. Because in those days, you went to elementary school if you were black, elementary school, and then you got a job afterwards. Besides, there were no high schools in the area. And so somehow my mother had this sense that if she could not educate herself, that she would not achieve anything at all. So at the age of 13, she ran away from home, moved to Birmingham, Alabama, which was 100 miles away or something like that, and got a job as a domestic worker, rented a room at the YWCA, and went to high school. And she was supported in this by her teachers and by members of the community, and as a matter of fact, eventually she was encouraged to go to college and got support and scholarships and so forth. And later she went to graduate school at NYU in education. And I grew up in a family that encouraged us to be involved in struggles that would uplift the entire community. And I could also see my mother as a teacher, and the gift of the desire for education, which was given to her probably by her teachers, since her parents her foster parents did not necessarily believe that she needed to be educated. She gave that gift of the desire for education to many, many, many students. As a matter of fact, at her memorial a couple of years ago when she passed, people my family had never had any contact with came to the memorial and testified about the fact that she gave them that sense that they could be anything that they wanted to be. And one of the things I should tell you about her is that she was a reading specialist. This is what she studied in graduate school. And she could literally teach anyone how to read. And in those days, we hadn't yet heard about reading disabilities and learning disabilities and so forth. So she was the person whom all of the other teachers in the school consulted when they had problems with a child who had challenges reading. They would bring the child to her, and she literally taught every single child who was brought to her how to read. And I should let you know that we had to learn how to read when we were 1 and 2, and by 3, all of us were reading books. So. And then my mother was involved in a number of, she was involved in the NAACP at a time when being a member of the NAACP was tantamount to being a communist, which I later became She was active in a number of cases, such as the Scottsboro 9 case back in the 30s. And when I was arrested, I don't know if, did Mariama tell you that I was on the FBI Symbols one? She did an introduction and I didn't even get to hear it. Well, my mother was really active in the campaign for my freedom, and she traveled all over the country. My sister was also active. She did a lot of international work. And my sister had just had, well, she had a baby while I was in jail, who was named after me. And there are photographs of my mother traveling with the baby because my sister's in France and Italy and other places organizing the campaign for my freedom. And my mother's in this country, and she has the baby in one hand, and she has her fist in the other. So I wanted to share that story with you because today we think primarily in terms of individuals. And I think I was very privileged to grow up in a family where we were encouraged not to focus so much on ourselves as individuals, but to think about what we could do to uplift our communities. And I mention this individualization of achievement because we also tend to individualize acts of injustice. And I'm thinking about the coverage, which I think is really good, that we've been seeing on the Trayvon Martin case. However, what distresses me is the fact that it is not linked to the overall historical context of such racist violence. The media have been approaching it as if the only challenge is to understand every single fact in that particular case. And by so myopically focusing on that one case, we forget that we're not simply talking about an individual case. We're talking about something that is structural, something that is historical. And one of the important aspects of racism is what you might call the learned capacity to ignore individuality at the expense of the generic. So you see the generic in the individual. But at the same time, there's the tendency to focus on cases as individual cases unrelated to others. So I want to mention some things that have happened over the last period and also during the last years. And excuse me, my voice is, I don't know whether it sounds so terrible to you. It's okay. No, it sounds really bad to me. I'm not used to sounding like this. I was boasting to someone, oh, I haven't had a cold for well over a year. And then, of course, a week later, I come down with a cold. Oh, good. Thank you. Thanks. So I want to just evoke some other cases. There's the case of James Anderson. How many of you are aware of that case? In Jackson, Mississippi. And as a matter of fact, last June, James Anderson, who's I think a 47-year-old black man, was killed as a result of being run down in a parking lot by a white teenager in Jackson, Mississippi. Apparently, 7 white teenagers had driven from a neighboring county to Jackson, looking for a black man to harass. And the person who was driving the truck that killed James Anderson recently pled guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison as a direct result of Anderson's family urging prosecutors not to use the death penalty in this case. And this is an interesting case because it is kind of reminiscent of the James Byrd case in Jasper, Texas, 1998. When James Byrd was dragged by the pickup truck, you remember? And what was also really interesting was that one of the men who was involved in his killing was executed on September 21st, which was exactly the same time as Troy Davis was executed. His name was Lawrence Brewer. And James Byrd's son, Ross Byrd, campaigned to spare this man, even though he said he had no regrets about what he did, he would do it again. I mean, he's just a flagrant white supremacist. But his son has been very active in the death penalty abolitionist movement. Now, I guess we can say that you're fortunate to live here in Rhode Island, where the death penalty has been abolished for some time. Very few people, relatively few people, have been killed by the state here. So maybe you should get involved in campaigning to abolish the death penalty in other states. I see that Connecticut is in the process of dismantling the death penalty. If I had time, I would say a few words about the death penalty, maybe during the question and answer period. But let me continue to evoke some other cases. Another case is the case of Oscar Grant. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area. I live in Oakland, and some of you may have heard about the killing on New Year's Day 2009 of Oscar Grant by Bay Area Rapid Transit police. And we saw the video. Many of you probably saw the video of him being killed as he was being restrained in handcuffs on the platform. Then in 1997, there was the case of Abner Louima, who was brutally beaten and tortured and sodomized by New York police officers. Abner Louima is a Haitian, an immigrant from Haiti. Then there was Sean Bell. More recently, I'm sure you remember that he was killed just before his wedding was to take place in New York. Excuse me. And then on June 7, 2010, a 15-year-old Mexican citizen by the name of Sergio Adrian Hernandez Huereca was shot to death by a border patrol agent near the El Paso Juarez port of entry. He was allegedly hanging out near the Rio Grande with a group of friends when border patrol agents began firing at him and others near him. Apparently, they said that someone was throwing rocks at them while they were attempting to detain what they called a few illegal immigrants. And I put illegal in scare quotes because I don't think any human being should be called illegal. And he was killed immediately, shot in the head. He died instantly, and he had never crossed the border into U.S. territory. So I could actually spend hours detailing cases, one after the other. I mean, I could go back to my childhood and I could talk about Emmett Till, I could talk about the civil rights workers. Racist violence has been such an integral part of this country since the days of colonization, the colonization of indigenous people, since the days of slavery, since the annexation of Mexican territory. And today we act as if it's exceptional. We exceptionalize these cases, and we get drawn in to the stories, and we get seduced by the fact that the media tend to look at these cases with blinders on. And we get involved in the arguments about who said what and who did what and so forth and so on. And we lose, I'm not saying that that's not important, but what I'm saying is that if we don't place it in the broader context, we completely ignore the meaning of that violence. I've been talking primarily about men. And another thing, we assume that men are usually the targets of this violence, particularly young men, particularly young men of color, right? And I should say that there are women who have been targeted by the same kind of violence. There was a case in Riverside, California, of Taisha Miller, who was shot by police as she was driving for no reason at all. And LaTanya Haggerty in Chicago. But what I want to emphasize today is the connections that we rarely make between private violence and public violence, between intimate violence and state violence, between institutionalized violence and domestic violence. It used to be the case that domestic violence was not even addressed by institutions. If an incident of domestic violence came to the attention of the police and they arrived and they discovered that a woman was being beaten by a husband or a partner, their response was, oh, this isn't a case for the police, this is a domestic issue. This is something that the man who is beating the woman has to resolve with her. The reason I raise this is because when we speak about violence, we usually think of men both as the perpetrators and as the victims of that violence. But as a matter of fact, women are the most consistent victims of violence in the entire world. And I want to talk about this case because I want to talk about this relationship, rather, as someone who embraces prison abolition. We talked about death penalty abolition. We can go a step further and say that prison should be abolished as the dominant mode of punishment. I think that the importance of creating a different perspective can be seen very clearly by looking at violence against women, the whole process of criminalizing violence against women, and the consequences. And just let me back up for a moment and say that when we exceptionalize these cases of violence, such as the Trayvon Martin case, we tend to focus on the perpetrator. And the demand in his case has been to arrest and prosecute George Zimmerman, right? For some 6 weeks now. And finally, the prosecutor, the special prosecutor, has decided to charge George Zimmerman with second-degree murder. And of course, there's a lot of controversy around that now. But even though individual perpetrators have to be held accountable for their actions, is the focus only on the individual going to resolve the structural problem, the institutional problem, the historical problem? George Zimmerman can be tried and convicted for second-degree murder. And is that going to change? Is that going to eradicate racist violence? And again, I'm backing up parenthetically. I'm going to get back to my analysis of the relationship of violence against women to this violence, the structural violence that we've been talking about. And just more water. Because I don't want you to think that when we call for the abolition of imprisonment as a dominant mode of punishment, the abolition of the death penalty, that we are saying that individuals should not be held accountable for what they do. Because individuals have created, have engaged in actions that are responsible for an incredible amount of harm in the world. But I wanted to tell the story about a woman in South Africa under apartheid who's a black woman whose husband and 2 sons, I believe it was 2 sons, were killed by a white South African policeman. I think he was a policeman or a military person. He was an official. And they came before the Truth and Reconciliation hearings. And she was asked what she wanted to happen to this man. Because the Truth and Reconciliation process allowed perpetrators and victims to come face to face with each other and to try to figure out, how to remake relationships. But in any event, apparently, when she was asked what she thought should happen to this man who had killed her husband and killed her sons, she looked at him and she said, "You have killed my husband, you have taken my sons, you have left me with no one. And so I want you to visit me every day and be my companion." And she was serious about that. And it makes us think critically about the way in which we emotionally assume that if someone has done harm to us, then we have to do harm to them. And that we cannot repair that relationship if we try. And so I say that to point out that there are a lot of ways in which one can imagine a different kind of justice. It doesn't have to be based on retribution. It doesn't have to be based on vengeance. And we're also steeped in this ideology of punishment that our first response is to imagine something bad happening to the person who has done something bad to us. That's inscribed in our emotions. Our emotions are not our own. In many ways, we incorporate the state in our emotions and our thoughts. And so, let me say that, drink a little tea. Okay, I think I'm better now. So I wanted to point out that in the last 40 years, we have engaged in campaigns against violence against women all over the world. And you're aware of the different kinds of programs that exist now. You're aware of all of the different agencies. The fact that police have had to do trainings on addressing these issues. And let me say that since the criminalization of violence against women, which was the major call from the women's movement, vast numbers of people, and not just men, but women also engage in violence. I don't want to convey the impression that in, say, same-sex relationships, you don't have that same kind of structure of violence often, because you do. But vast numbers of perpetrators of violence against women have been in prison all over the world. And one would think that that would mean that the rate of violence against women would decline, right? I mean, if that is at least a part of the solution. But as a matter of fact, it has not changed at all. More and more and more people are arrested and imprisoned, but women continue to be the targets of the worst kind of violence. And I think it's important as we look at cases such as the Trayvon Martin case, to also recognize that violence happens within the family. And that feminists have pointed out that one of the most dangerous places in the world is within the family. But we like to pretend as if the family were a haven, and that the violence comes from the outside, and that it's always about the stranger danger. The philosopher Louis Althusser said that the family is one of a number of ideological state apparatuses. The family is an ideological state apparatus. And in many ways, we imbibe the ideology of the state through the family. That's how we learn how to be in the world. And in many ways, you can say that's how we learn to become comfortable with violence. And what's really interesting about the fact that that women constitute such a minority in prisons all over the world, 5, 6, 7% maybe, we tend to assume that, well, women just don't commit criminal acts like men do. But my argument would be that women get punished within intimate spheres, within private spheres. Men tend to be punished more in the public realm, subject to public violence. Women tend to be subject more to private violence. And it's almost as if the men and people who play that role in situations where violence is inflicted on women get delegated by the state to, I mean, I'm thinking about this as an image, not as an analysis, but there is clearly a relationship between the fact that gender violence is such a pandemic all over the world. And we don't think about the connections to other modes of violence. Now, I wanted to also point out, before my time runs out, that the punishment that happens to students in school, to kids in school, is also connected to those circuits of violence. Not long ago, the Department of Education released a study that indicates that black students are much more likely to be punished than white students, from kindergarten to high school. Black students accounted for only 18% of the schools that were sampled, and they constituted 46% of those suspended more than once, and 39% of all expulsions. Black and Latino students were 70% of those involved in school arrests or referred to law enforcement. And what's interesting is that disabled Black and Latino students were even more disproportionately punished. And the extent to which racialized populations are considered to be legitimate targets of violence, and the extent to which women as a group are considered to be legitimate targets of violence has a great deal to do with the historical evolution of racism and sexism and class structures in our worlds. Now, I was going to talk a bit about the Violence Against Women Act, but maybe someone can ask me about that during the question and answer period, because I see I have. How long have I been speaking?
Not long enough.
I think my timer I didn't set it or it already went off. Let me see, I really want us to have a conversation. So, let me just use one word example, which is really hard. It's hard to talk about. And it's something that we don't want to talk about. We don't like to think about. And that is child molestation. Everybody hates sex offenders. Everybody. From the most revolutionary to the most conservative. Nobody wants to talk about sex offenders. And as a matter of fact, the assumption is what you do is you just put them in prison. You keep them in prison as long as you can. And if they get out, you have registries so that you know if a sex offender is living in your neighborhood, right? Now, what's really interesting is that many people who engage in, especially the sexual molestation of children, which is one of the hardest topics to discuss. It's because it's so painful that we don't want to think about it. We want to move on to something else. And we want to move on to the punishment. See, this is why the punishment plays it allows us to deflect our attention. We jump from that really difficult place where sometimes we have to dwell on what's painful in order to figure out how to begin to purge our society of these problems. But instead, we jump to the punishment. And we go to anger and retribution and vengeance. And that is a kind of, that's a kind of fast food solution. You know, it does the same thing. We have this, in this country, we want everything quickly. You know, we want a book, we order it on Amazon, and we want it the very next day. Right? We order food at McDonald's, we want it in 3 seconds. I can remember some years ago I brought the Grenadian Performing Company over to, this was before the coup in Grenada, and I have to admit, I took them to Kentucky Fried Chicken. It wasn't called KFC then. And this is before I became a vegan. So they ordered, and the food came immediately, and they were stunned. And their response was, no, this can't be our food, we just ordered it, right? And that has remained in my mind because it's kind of a metaphor for the way we like to, you know, have everything done instantaneously. And also for the way in which we are often afraid to dwell and develop a kind of patience. And particularly in these challenging issues. And oftentimes it's because we have some experience with them ourselves. And we don't want to think about them. We want to repress them. And the way we repress them is to move to the question of punishment. And we know that that most people who sexually molest children have been victims at one point in their lives. And the victim becomes the perpetrator. And by simply criminalizing and sending the perpetrator to prison, what we are doing is suggesting that it's okay for that cycle to continue. Because whoever that person molested may grow up and become a molester, him or herself. And organizations that have seriously attempted to deal with this issue argue that it's going to take a very long time. And as a matter of fact, there is an organization called Generation 5 that consists of both abusers and people who've been abused. They are the ones who run and are members of the organization. And they say that it's going to take 5 generations. They say, they're called Generation 5 because it's going to take 5 generations. That is, if we start working really hard today, then we can hope that 5 generations from now, we won't have to deal with this pandemic of sexual abuse of children. But we don't have the patience. I mean, we don't have the patience to wait for a few minutes, you know, much less to be involved in a process that we know is going to take us far beyond the spans of our own lifetimes. But that is what it will take. And this is why I think that the context of prison abolition is important because it takes away from us the false solution of the prison or of the death penalty. It doesn't allow us to rely on that. It doesn't allow us to engage in that kind of deflective logic that prevents us from dwelling there at places of pain and difficulty. Now, I think that I mean, I hope that I've made some connections that make sense to you. And this conference is about the quest for justice. And what I'm suggesting is that the quest for justice has to be conceptualized in a way that is very different from the justice we're used to thinking about. We're used to thinking about justice that is retributive, justice that is based on vengeance. And I would like us to think about justice that consists in remaking our societies and our relations among each other. And I think the prison abolition movement offers us a dramatic way of continuing the struggle for freedom in the 21st century. And finally, imagining and struggling for a world whose landscape is not crowded by prisons and other carceral institutions is to imagine and struggle for a world without violence. A world without violence against Black boys, Latino boys, a world without violence against women, a world without intimate violence, and a world without state violence. Thank you very much.